minutes each, reading from their work and kind of situating their work a little bit in their practice, maybe discussing a little bit about how Jewish identity operates or doesn't in their work and in their inspiration. So we'll have each of the four do 10 minutes, and then I will have some questions for them, and we will take some and I hope they'll have some questions for each other. And then we'll take questions from all of you. So thrilled to have everyone here, and thank you to these four talented writers for joining us today. So first, if I can just have the four, if everyone else could put themselves on mute, and if I could just have the four participants unmute themselves to say hello, and do a very quick introduction of themselves. You got the brief bios in the materials, but love to have each of you just say a word or two, and then we'll start going around. So Katherine, would you mind just introducing yourself to the group so they recognize your face and your voice?
Sure. My name is Katherine Locke. I live in Philadelphia. I write pretty much for all ages. I've written for adults. I largely write for children, from picture books through young adult novels right now.
Great. Thank you, Katherine. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Dougherty. I also live in Philadelphia. I grew up at RS and I'm still a congregant today. I write children's picture books specializing in illustrated nonfiction, but I started as an illustrator, so I feel like it's all very illustration focused.
Thank you, Rachel. Robin?
Hi, I'm Robin Black. I live sometimes in Philadelphia. We've passed the pandemic out here in Bucks County. I write for adults, and I have written short stories, a novel, a book of essays, and I'm now writing a book about Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So I've sort of done a lot of genre jumping, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robin. And Louise, you need to unmute yourself.
Well, hi for everyone. I'm Louise Simons, and hopefully for many of you, I've been in Torah study with you or have been in services with you and have known you over the years. And lovely to see you. It's really exciting to me because I'm now living in the country in Lower Gwynedd, which is not really as far out as Robin, but still it's not in the city and not in South Philly where I was formerly living. So I've always been writing. I've always knew, even when I was a child, that I was going to write. So here we are.
Thank you. So Louise, if you wouldn't mind being first.
No, I'd love to.
We'd love to hear from you. So just a reminder to everyone, 10 minutes. I'm going to be really strict on the timing so that we have enough time to chat with everyone afterwards. Louise is going to read from a poem, Black T-shirts on the laundry room floor. Louise, Danny is sharing the screen. Do you want, something's on the screen. Do you want to just read? Do you need any? Oh, I'm sorry. Ellen. Hold on one second. I'm sorry, Louise. We have a.
Take your time.
Okay. Ellen or Gail, do you want to do the prayer for study? I missed that part of the assignment. I'm terribly sorry.
I would be glad to.
Thank you.
Everybody can unmute or mute yourself. So let's start in. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, so now we're back again to you, Louise. So sorry about that.
Ivy, some of the time when Gail was speaking, there was an echo, and I didn't know if it was people or Gail. So if there is and you want to interrupt and let me know, no problem. All right, everybody, I'm going to read from a poem, Black T-shirts Full on the Laundry Room Floor. It's a long poem, and in many ways, it's a visual poem. So you can see that, hopefully you can see that the stanzas go outward. Yo, Mother Moon. After hours, Mother Moon, smooth your careworn maternal face with sunscreens and broad spectrum lotions, PAPA-free, fragrance-free, child-proof protection. Hot Mama Moon, speak easy. Say the names of Philomella's sisters at midnight, those blue indigo sisters singing in the past who vamped the microphones, parted the clubs, and crooned their lonely deaths long before they died. Moon Chariot, slippery when I was young, silver pumpkin moon that used to drive outside our car above the trees, following us home from New York to New Jersey. Killer moon, trailing us like a sleuth, lingering behind pillowy clouds to shadow us as we rode our black car, heading home on the nighttime skyway. Moon Maid, sailing on high, patrolling the sky skis from your lofty crow's nest. You direct the ever-flowing tides to cleanse the fair earth's dark corners. Scrubby moon, tight little curled up fist, seizing, shaking the memory tree till showers of leaves come flowing down. Now you seem pale to my faded eyes, but then, but only then, you look brighter and closer too. Sallow crones sweeping the skyways, not on a broom of tied branches, but a speed shark, cutting from lane to lane, sitting aside a Stingray, Camaro, Corvette, Saturn, Lexus, Acura, Taurus, Bronco, Jag, Porsche. Ms. Moon, your late night star children sleep all day behind cloud covers. In spring, outside playing hide and seek. Summer, shoot the shoots and Perseid showers. In fall, bobbing for apples in the deep sky bucket. In winter, hanging tinseled pendants to decorate the skies. Moon Mom, by reversing the charges, your cellular offspring morph into far-flung calling card, hardwired hackers. Out of the clubs, the fitness center, the fortune teller, flaunting our perfect lifelines as long as a sleepless night. Your stellar children sip green tea, twig tea, chai tea. We garden organically, ready to harvest our heirloom tomatoes, chicory, chives, collards, curly parsley, scallions, baby arugula, water spinach, basil, tarragon, sage, thyme, marjoram, and always mint. Moonstruck youth who booked the bands, the fickle, inconstant bands, Mudhoney, Nirvana, Eugenius, Hole, Screaming Trees, Green River, Soul Asylum, Velocity Girl, Dinosaur Jr., Smashing Pumpkins, Urge Overkill, Pegboy, Clean Jesus Lizard, Jane's Addiction, Mentors, Naked Raygun, Hole, Beat Happenings, Pavement, Babes in Toyland, Sonic Youth, and of course, Spaceman 3. Moon Marchers, Black Matters Marchers, Blowouts. Still, we remember their lives. Trayvon Martin, Tanisha Anderson, Reika Boyd, Betty Jones, Mike Brown, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Samuel DuBose, Amadou Diallo, Philandro Castillo, Nina Pop, Eric Garner, Desmond Franklin, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd and Freddie Gray, Oscar Grant and Tony McDade and John Crawford, protests, and Emmett Till, I Can't Breathe Till. All right. Poem. So after my poem, I think you'll know I won't be fooling you when I say that when the question was asked me, how does my writing intersect with my Judaism? I thought of two ways actually that it does, but essentially, I feel that in my Jewish soul, there's a yearning for tikkun olam, for something deeply felt and heartwarming, the desire, the wish, the urge to repair the world, to cure the world. And I believe that this urgent urge is something that unites us in our contemporary life, even with these lives that we have now that are so scattered and don't feel attached. But I think that they do attach us to our biblical past. And more importantly, tikkun olam, this repair, is the glue that holds my life together. And so, just to put it simply, I try to live an honorable life. And I think that that desire is the theme, or is certainly thematic in my writing. All right, folks. I think back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise. Really beautiful and lots to think about and marinate on. And we will come back to you. I'm sure that everyone's got lots of questions about moons and mamas and your influences. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to ask Katherine if you would read next.
Sure.
Thank
So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my work first to kind of contextualize it for you. I'm the author of The Girl with the Red Balloon, which won a Sidney Taylor honor from the Association of Jewish Libraries in 2018. The sequel, The Spy with the Red Balloon. And then I co-edited and contributed to an anthology of Jewish young adult stories by Jewish authors. And it's really writing Jewish stories for teens is really, really important to me. When I was growing up, almost all of the Jewish literature that I was consuming as a teenager was Holocaust literature. And there is, I'm not saying we should get rid of Holocaust literature. In fact, I really think that we need those stories more than ever. But I also really want teens to have stories that aren't trauma focused and that aren't centered around genocide. Stories where Jewish people have agency and are heroes and have fun. And also, this is all contemporary. Our one rule for writers was that it all had to be contemporary and it all had to be uplifting in some way. And so that was really important to us as editors. I edited it with Laura Silverman. But that's kind of how I go into all of my work. So a lot of my novels are still depressing, but I'm always aware that I want to show a Jewish experience that I think has been overlooked in some way. So I'm going to read for you from actually my 2022 novel. It comes out from Knopf sometime in spring 2022. And it is the story of a Jewish teenager at the heart of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. And I went over to Budapest and researched over there. And then that was really, really informative. I don't know that I could have written this book without doing that. So I'm just going to read you the opening piece from this novel. This is called This Rebel Heart. When she woke in pieces. This happened often. She had to pull herself together. In her sleep, Chilatiza's body drifted apart. Her hands were always farthest, reaching for the window that was bolted shut, the window that faced the Danube River. She was always returning to the river. She assembled herself, letting the skin knit edge to edge, seamless except to those looking for the seams of her. Her shoulder touched and bonded again to her upper arm to her elbow to her forearm to her wrist bones to her hands. Only then could she curl her fingers against her palm, the fist sending a pulse of pain to her mind. That was how she knew she was connected again, the pain. Her eyes never left her skull. It was as if they knew better. They had seen things out in the world that they didn't want to see again. They'd rather stay here, beneath the quilt her mother made, in the bed where her parents made her, in an apartment 1/4 the size it was when she was a child, when she was 1/4 the size she was now. Sheila's hair stayed attached to her head too, moon-colored as it had been since the day she was born. It was luminous, catching and throwing the light like a prism, every strand reflecting and deflecting, so it was impossible not to stare at the threaded lines on the walls that moved when she moved. She wore the river on her head. There was little color left in Budapest since the end of the war. The Soviets marched in and color marched out. In truth, by the time the Soviets arrived, the only color left in Budapest was blue, the color of the sky, the color of baby's eyes, the color of the thread in her father's tallit, the color of her mother's favorite dress. Next to her, in the only bed they had, her aunt slept mostly in one piece, as one body. Her aunt never drifted too far from herself. Sheila took a deep breath, pressing her hand flat against her chest, just above her left breast. Her heart beat against her palm. She was alive. Somewhere beyond this bed, somewhere beyond this window, the river whispered to her. She could feel the whispers in her chest, could hear them in her mind. When she was a child, before the war, before the river, her parents spoke to each other in Yiddish, a language they didn't share with her. This was how the river felt to her, a language that soothed her, a constant presence, but one she barely understood. When she was a child and her parents spoke Yiddish, she had wanted to understand. By the time she was old enough to understand, they'd use Yiddish to speak about her or about the things they didn't want her to hear or to fight. They had stopped speaking Yiddish. Her mother had continued to speak Yiddish with her sister, Chila's Aunt Alona, but that was the entirety of the Yiddish left after the war, after the Shoah, quiet words between sisters in the early mornings over cups of coffee and in the bathroom where one brushed the other's hair. When her parents died, so did the Yiddish in their home. Chila had only had the river left and its quiet, ceaseless murmurings. So that is it from me.
So, Katherine, thank you so much. I think we're all feeling a little frustrated that we have to wait a year for the book to come out, but we'll have lots more to talk to you about, and really exciting to hear something that's kind of not out in the world yet, and feel like we're getting a little bit of a preview, but want to hear about Budapest and the inspiration around this as well. So thank you so much, Katherine. Robin, would you be next, please? Robin, you're on mute.
Somebody always does that, and this time it was me. So I'm just going to read a section first from my novel, Life Drawing, which came out a few years back now. And I wanted to read the central figure in the book is a painter, but I wanted to read this section about her painting process because I thought, you know, we're talking about the writing process, and really when I wrote about the painting process, it was pretty close to home for me. So this is my narrator, whose name is Augusta Edelman. It is typical of productive artistic periods for me that they have their origins in something beyond my control. That's true of the bad times too, of course, which is the hell of it. My work that summer had started with a bathroom renovation we had finally gotten around to a few weeks before Allison's arrival. The second floor hall bathroom was a wreck. It had never been used much, so we'd always ignored it. But that winter, the tiles had started popping off the walls, and somehow that made the sagging ceiling intolerable. In May, we took a few bids, all of which were low. Nobody had enough work. Everyone was cutting their profits. We went with the man who seemed most amiable, and before a week passed, he had a crew there doing demolition. I spent an irritated morning listening to the bangs and shattering to the too loud blaring radio and then around noon went up to ask if they needed anything for their lunch. Something caught my eye, a pile of old newspapers twisted and crumpled in my hall. What are those? From when the house was built, the contractor, Thad, told me people used those to insulate back in the day. The first thing I did was iron them. Owen laughed because in all the years we'd been together, neither of us had ever ironed anything. The iron had come with the house. It took me a long time. It took me far longer than it had to because I got caught in watching the way the faces, the images, and the words came clear. The crumples themselves were like a blurred focus that I could manipulate. And there was also inevitably a sensation of moving backward in time, not only because the papers were old, but because the act of crumpling a newspaper is a strictly forward moving act. It isn't something one normally does, then undoes. The ironing process became all about restoration for me. Restoration, clarity, and then also loss, war, 1918, World War I. Crumpled newspapers with body counts, with surges of hope documented, defeats, deaths, and more deaths, homecomings, and more deaths. I recrumpled some to get the feel of doing that, just the act of bringing the names of the slaughtered into focus and then obscuring them again, then back into focus. I began to jot notes about permanence and impermanence. I began to imagine the newspapers themselves in other forms, things that could not be crumpled, chiseled in stone, etched into metal. I took one and burned it in a small copper bowl I had, and saved the ashes. Why? I didn't know why. I'd stopped thinking sensibly, which is not how projects usually begin for me. But from the beginning, this was different. This was about ideas, about intuition, something intriguing me that I didn't understand. And in the beginning, that felt right. I took pictures of the bathroom still under construction, of the space between the walls where the papers had been entombed. I thought about the papers having been used for warmth and of the heat of the iron bringing them back. I tried to make something of that. I thought of the tiles popping off, of the pressures exerted, not by the fluctuations of temperatures over years, but by the words and images themselves. There are moments in a creative life when you understand why you do it. Those moments might last a few seconds, or maybe for some people, years. But whatever the actual time that passes, they still feel like a single moment, fragile in the way a moment is, liable to be shattered by a breath, set apart from all the other passing time, distinct. But then it changes, and what seemed unimaginably exhilarating gets bogged down, even when a project is going well. It is a gradual, inevitable sobering during which your right to be passive diminishes. What the ether has given you now, in fact, belongs to you. And then it is work. Then it is hard.
That's nice.
So, that's very much sort of my creative process, I guess. I actually wrote this whole sort of thing because I thought we were supposed to, but I think I'm going to spare you that and just kind of digest it for you. I write primarily what are called aftermath stories. I am interested most of all in kind of the depths of my being, in questions of survival and in questions of recovery, and in particular in what I consider to be this kind of basic act of creativity that all human beings share, which is the perpetual creation of hope, which is something that happens against logic very often. So my work is an exploration, I suppose, of people who have had something tragic befall them and how it is they do and don't put their lives back together. You know, and I was thinking a lot actually, as I was trying to answer the question about how my Judaism intersects with my work. There is no obvious answer to that. A lot of my characters are Jewish. I don't think that's the answer. But what I should just give you some background. I was raised by an atheist Jewish mom and a very religious Christian dad. And the result was nothing in me in terms of actual religion, but strong identification with Judaism, and particularly with the women who surrounded me when I was growing up. My mother, my grandmother, who was bedridden and lived with us for 10 years, her 6 sisters, who were all characters. And I think spending a lot of time with them, all of them survivors, all of them much, much older than I was. I mean, when I knew them well, they were in their 70s and 80s, and I was a kid. And just being pulled toward the degree to which they had no interest in sugarcoating the world. And I don't know if that's a particularly Jewish characteristic, this combination of really seeing a thing as it is, still believing that life is this tremendous gift, approaching things with resilience and humor. I associate it with Judaism because it was from my Jewish family that I got these characteristics and that I think are in my work. But it's an interesting question to me. And I will just say, in a world of rampant anti-Semitism rising and raging, I think the question for me also is how will my Judaism intersect with my work going forward? Because it feels ever more important that it do so publicly. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Robin. And I like that question for the whole panel later on. How will our Judaism intersect with our work? And it might be interesting to think about if that changes moving forward for any of us. That was really a beautiful passage. Thank you so much. And Rachel is going to share her screen with us while she presents. So I think that Danny has to give her permission to share screen, and then we'll switch over to Rachel's screen.
Well, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you all. I'm Rachel, as I said. I grew up in the RS community when it was at the suburban campus in Elkins Park. I'm going to talk about my work more than read to you, because my picture book takes about 11 minutes to read all the way through, and without context, I think it's a little, and without page turns, it's not what it is. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I spend some of my time these days, which is illustrating and writing picture books for children. So I went to school for illustration, and making art for kids is where the joy of picture books really is for me, which is why I always say that I'm an illustrator first and an author second. There's so much storytelling in the images alone. So I didn't really know that I wanted to write picture books or write anything for a really long time. I was happy just making artwork. But I want to talk to you about my first picture book that came out in 2019. It was my first work as an author and illustrator. So like the whole thing is me, and why I wanted to illustrate this book as well as write it. Like why I felt the need to carve this book out of nothing. So that is what I'm going to talk to you about. To do that, I'm actually going to stop this and share the PDF of the book. Again, it's not the same as turning the pages and giving you that experience, but it's a little bit easier than me holding a book in front of a Zoom screen. So Secret Engineer is about Emily Roebling, who I think is sort of like the unsung hero of the Brooklyn Bridge project. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge. I definitely was growing up in Philadelphia, but I didn't know about her. So when I first learned about Emily's story, which is in very brief, she married this gentleman named Washington Roebling, whose father designed the Brooklyn Bridge and many other bridges, but he passed away before construction ever began, and Washington took over as chief engineer. This is sort of an explanation of him taking over as chief engineer, but also in my telling of this story, it's very much about the bridge. It is not just about Emily's struggle or Emily's learning. It is about how bridges work, which is part of the appeal for me. So Washington actually got nitrogen poisoning, which is a fun topic to explain to 5-year-olds, but I've now done it a lot. He got nitrogen poisoning and he was bedridden for most of the bridge process. And Emily sort of took over and unnamed in the bridge process and had to learn all of this stuff about civil engineering and about how the bridge operates and also how construction administration works. So my whole goal with this story was to teach young readers the mechanics of bridge building, as well as tell you Emily's story. So you're sort of learning along with her as you're reading it, how bridges are built and how they don't fall into rivers, as well as this woman's fantastic story from 1873. So this is my book. If you're asking me why on earth would you want to tell the story, let me see. Hang on. I wish I could have 2 windows open is the problem with the screen sharing. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Back to this one. Cool. Whoop. So why did I have this idea for this book? I'm sure some of you have read any of David McCullough's many books, or even this one. I was reading this book just for fun. It's a great book. I love David McCullough as a writer. I love The Great Bridge as a book, but he does mention Emily, and it is really like the hero of David McCullough's telling of the bridge is Washington Roebling. But he mentions Emily using these words, which bummed me out considerably. So I wanted to read more about it, and I happened upon this book called Silent Builder. It is the only adult biography that I have ever seen about Emily Roebling. It is written by a woman named Marilyn Weigold. It came out in 1984 in an academic press. I had to go to some college libraries to read it and not even check it out because that is how hard it is to find. Again, nobody really knows this person's story until very lately, which is great because actually there's a fiction book sort of based on her life that came out this year, which is so cool. But in it, she quotes Emily Roebling saying this, which I think is just like, oh, if I had read this as a young person, I would have been really blown away. So I thought, you know, this is a story that I'd like to tell, and I'd especially like to draw, which is where the love is for me. So to give you an idea of how much of this process was Emily, that red line is the part in the timeline in which she took over the construction process, which is most of it. So I'd heard of John Roebling, I'd heard of the Wire Bridge, but somehow nobody had ever really emphasized this involvement to me. That is a painting of Emily Roebling from when she lived. And the thing that I liked best about Emily's story is that she had this like super huge, giant, scary challenge just dropped in her lap. She had no ambitions from a young age to be a civil engineer, but she really rose up to meet it, which I think is a really inspiring story. So how did I go from having this idea to making a picture book? Obviously, the first step is to read as much as I could about a picture book and learn or read about Emily Roebling and try to form that into a novel. Some of these things that I read were novels, were nonfiction books, were one graphic novel, which is actually really fascinating. She's not in it much, but it's still a really fascinating story of the Brooklyn Bridge. Some of them are other picture books that are just about how bridges work. I looked at original drawings. I talked to folks at historical societies. This is something I had never done and didn't really think that, you know, this is part of a picture book author's journey, but it was definitely part of mine. I collected lots of folders and folders and folders of notes and reference photos. I met many great, helpful civil engineers. It was, I don't know, the biggest project I've ever done. And of course I went to the bridge. My hair was longer then though. And then I started on sketches because I, like I said, I'm a person who thinks pretty visually. So I actually did a bunch of drawings for this before I wrote any words down. So this was the first draft of Secret Engineer. There were holes where words will go, but no words written. I did end up slotting them in when we first submitted this, of course, but the drawings came first. Most of these drawings are still in the book, but a lot of them weren't. These are like little teeny tiny sketches. And then I did the final sketches once we pitched the book and ended up having it taken in. And then little by little, I made all of the artwork. I make my artwork traditionally, so I don't use a computer. These are all paintings done in gouache and acrylic on paper with some ink and a little bit of colored pencil now and again, but most of the time it's gouache. And that's pretty much the whole story of how the book was made. This plaque is actually on the Brooklyn Bridge, and I just wanted to point it out to all of you because I had been to the Brooklyn Bridge probably 4 or 5 times in my life and walked right by this every single time. I thought this was a fascinating thing to find. So yeah, in the back of every great work, we can find the self-sacrificing devotion of a woman. I don't fully agree, I guess, but I loved seeing this here. So that's Secret Engineer. It's definitely, the best part of it was reading it to many young, hopefully engineers, but in the very least curious folks. I will stop sharing this to answer the question, how does my work intersect with my Jewish identity? To be honest, so far it hasn't really. I mean, I've done some artwork that I would say like is about my life and is about my identity in like a personal capacity that feels Jewish, but my published work has not yet really been focused on Judaism. I will say, I think the heart of almost all of my work is about learning and about the love of learning that I do think is very like aligned with Jewish values that was taught to me from a very young age, that like to be the people of the book. So I think that thread runs through, but overtly Jewish content is not something I have ever produced.
Rachel, thank you so much for letting us into your creative process and sharing that with us. While you were speaking, I looked up the painting of Emily, which is at the Brooklyn Museum. And I was happy to see that the label at the Brooklyn Museum is called A Brooklyn Power Couple. And it talks about the two of them and does give Emily some decent credit there. So good on them for getting that together. So Rachel, I'm just going to start with you because I'm curious to hear then. This was 2019. What are you working on now? And what are the things that are inspiring you now?
Cool.
And while you're thinking of your answer, hang on one sec. I just want to make sure that I'm going to ask a few questions and then I hope that the 4 of you will ask each other some. But any of this gang, please, I guess use the chat and I will share questions with our participants. Okay, thanks. Rachel, what's happening now?
I have 2 sort of irons in the fire, but nothing I would say concrete. One is a book on the sort of the history of colors and how colors are made, which I feel like is definitely the toughest project I've ever done. And it's been taking me a really long time to sort of nail it down. But it's also really rewarding, and I feel like it scratches an art school itch that I've had going for a long time. To think of colors as like both a commodity and then also as a social construct is a lot to bite off for a 1st grade audience, but that is something I've been working on. And I'm also like in the very early stages of starting a nonfiction graphic novel project with an author that I really respect, and we'll see if we can go forward. And it's about a 60-year-old mountain climber female mountain climber in 1911 who was climbing the Andes.
Wow. Great. Well, we'll all stay tuned, and I think everyone is, and I hope everyone is out buying Rachel's book, and I hope we're all doing it from great local bookstores and not from Amazon. So, or if you have special, Rachel, any of you have special places that you know, or particularly you're supportive of your work in Philadelphia, we'd love to support them as well by buying your books from them. Katherine, I can't see Katherine right now, but I guess you'll
I'm
pop
here.
up again. Great. I'm intrigued by the fact that you write and have written romance novels, novels for young adults, middle grades, and picture books. And I think we'd all love to hear, how do you decide what topic you're matching up with what audience, and how does that work for you in your creative process?
That's a really good question. I usually know pretty early. The only time you can kind of get a little nebulous, and I might move an idea back and forth, is middle grade to young adult. But usually I try to think of what age I would have been at that story would have resonated the most. So I just actually took a young adult novel and moved it down to middle grade. And in part is because I felt like that story was actually better told through a more straightforward plot structure than I tend to write in my young adult novels. And that if I tried to make it as big as my young adult novels tend to be, then I would lose the heart of the story I was trying to tell. So sometimes I go back and forth with ideas, but usually I know pretty quickly where something's going to be. And I write across a lot of categories, largely because I get bored very quickly and I need to keep my brain entertained and active. So I'm always like, I drafted, they're not good yet, but I drafted 2 picture books yesterday, and like tonight I'm going to work on a middle grade, and like that. So I try to switch gears a lot, but I used to trick myself by having like a cafe that I wrote at for picture books, and a cafe I wrote at for middle grade, and a cafe I wrote at for young adult books. And that was like a way to train my brain to be in different zones. And the pandemic has destroyed that. So now I've had to learn how to write everything sitting in the same desk. That has been challenging.
Ellen is asking what the difference is between young adult and an adult novel.
So that is a really good question. That's the fuzziest line for me. I would say about 50% of my readers are adult readers, just because of the types of books that I write. But for me, a young adult novel is a novel with a teen protagonist that centers a teenage coming of age, or grappling with that moment of limit, like when teens are in that liminal space of like the choice between staying in a family structure versus entering a new world or changing that world. That's kind of where I like to center my YA stories. And there's this fairy tale scholar, Jack Zipes, who wrote this thing about fairy tales, where he said a fairy tale is a story of a young protagonist leaving home to reconstitute home. And I always come back to that. For me, a young adult novel is about a teenage protagonist changing their concept of home, or changing their home to better fit them.
That's so interesting. And before I move on, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this Rebel Heart that you read today, and how you decided on this subject matter and Budapest?
Yeah, so I felt a little lost after writing The Girl with the Red Balloon and The Spy with the Red Balloon. I wasn't sure about where to go next, and I knew I wanted to write another historical light fantasy, like a magical realism aspect to it, as you heard in that opening. But I wasn't sure where. So I kind of started just digging through history and being like, what did I not learn about that seems like I should have learned about it? I thought about writing a book about Prague Spring, but that was really top down. And so that didn't give me quite the narrative that I wanted with a teenage protagonist. I needed something that felt bottom up. And the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which I didn't learn about, even though my degree is in political science, I did not ever learn about it. And it was started by students. It was largely a student movement that tipped into revolution. They did not necessarily, most of them did not think that they were starting a revolution. They really started out as a protest. And I started writing this in the spring, or over the like February to March of 2018. And that felt like a really important time to be talking about student-led, youth-led movements that were against fascism, or not fascism. In Hungary, it was more like an autocratic communist state, but against an autocratic system, in support of a more pluralistic society. And so it felt timely. So that's where I started. And then I did the math on, if I put a teenager in 1956, that makes her a Holocaust survivor. And that also pretty dramatically changed how I approached the book once I did the math on when she would have been born and what she would have gone through.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Katherine. Louise, I'm going to find her again. And Louise, are you there and off mute?
No, I'm here.
There you are. Great. Thank you. Tell us about how, just again, the genesis of an idea, and maybe specifically around this poem, like how did you start on this subject matter? What's the imagery that inspired you to start writing this poem, or any poem? We're really, I think we just want to understand what inspires you and how you put pen to paper on a particular idea.
Well, okay, thanks for that question. Anything I write is pretty much close to home. So I began by thinking about myself as a little girl riding in the back seat of the car. We lived in New Jersey, but we came to visit my parents, and my parents brought us to visit my grandparents, their parents, and the greater family in Philadelphia. Or we went to New York also from Jersey, where we were living, and coming home in the backseat of the car alone and watching the moon travel with us. And so that picture from childhood stayed with me. And as with everything, you know, things are very close to me, and they marinate for a long time. As you used the word marinate, I thought that was great for my work. And then they come out in their own shape, not my shape, but they come out as they are. And so the moon became more to me than simply this something that is so unstrangely followed us and could always be with us. The moon could be with us when we started, the moon could be with us when we ended, and it had come with us the whole time. So I loved that. And I've always thought, you know, Mother Moon is close.
Thank you. Gail has a great question for you, and that is that, Louise, you were a co-founder and co-editor of a literary magazine, and you might talk about that a little bit. But Gail wants to know, how did the editor and writer in you make their piece?
Well, I've always been supportive of other writers, so that's a very easy question to answer. The second part. The first part is that I was co-founder and co-editor of 2 magazines years and years ago that are both still in existence. So I feel that is remarkable, truthfully, because most small literary magazines come and go. One was the American Poetry Review, and the second one was the Painted Bride Quarterly. And other younger poets and writers have continued our beginning work and have stayed with it, kept with it. So that's been the exciting part of my life. There was poetry scene in New York, of course, and then coming from New York to Philly and thinking, well, where are the poets here? Who are they? And then finding that when we started, my co-editor, Painted Bride Quarterly, particularly Dan Evans and I, when we started our magazine, we found that the poets were all around us. And so we had a poetry series at the Y, for example, and at the Painted Bride Art Gallery, which was on South Street in those days, the center. And so I've always been lucky to have poets and writers all around me. And I have always been encouraging. You know, I've never put myself first. I've always thought of everyone, because it's easier to write when you have people with you who are writing, and you get a sense from them that what you're doing matters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Louise. And maybe like Katherine, you write your own poetry in one place and you edit other people's elsewhere. Do you have different places, different hats you put on for different functions? Louise?
Oh, are you talking to me? Okay, like Katherine, do I do that? Okay, well, I was listening to that and thinking what Katherine was going to answer, but now I'm thinking for myself. Okay.
Well, goes to one cafe when she's writing young adult novels, and another cafe when she's writing
well, here it is.
Sorry,
Yeah.
something else. Yeah.
It's an interesting question, because here it is for my life. One time I was speaking to a group of teachers with a poet, another Pennsylvania poet, Jerry Stern, and one of the teachers asked him, "Do you write poetry for children?" And he said, "What do you call poetry not for children? Because that's the poetry that I write." And seriously, I always felt that that spoke for me also. However, lately, I've been writing poetry for children, and I wrote a little book, The Rhyming Dragon, and I see myself now as being in a very different place from the place I was so many years ago. My life has moved on, and I'm influenced, of course, by my reading. You know, there's so many, we're all surrounded by so many great writers, and that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you.
I think just, I want to just finish this up, just to say, just to listen to the other women who have been speaking today in this program, I'm inspired by them. I find they're wonderful. They're
Yep.
awesome. And they are gaining their inspiration from the world around us. And then they're giving that to me. So thank you, ladies. Thank you so much.
Yes, I think we can all agree with that. All four of you are very inspiring. And I think we're all leaving with, or are experiencing very full hearts and minds. Louise, Ellen has a question about the poem you read, which is that it starts with such beauty and ends in such tragedy. How did that become the arc of the poem?
Well, we're living in a time now when we have to reckon with our own selves and who we always were, as well as our own society. We all have to think back. And I was telling my co-editor Dan that when I was a little girl and I would see Black drivers stopped and being ticketed in Philadelphia, I would think to myself, well, I guess Black drivers are not such good drivers. Oh, well, now how do I look at that? I look at that from a totally different perspective. And so we all must move on with our own time.
Ivy, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, there's someone mowing their lawn, so I'm trying to stay muted when I'm not speaking, but I'll speak up. Thank you so much, Katherine. But Robin, you've talked about, and written about what teaching means to you, and you teach an MFA program, I think you still do, at Rutgers Camden. Wondering how your teaching interacts with with your work, and again, your different hats and how they bounce off each other.
So I really love teaching, and I find that when I'm teaching, I'm learning as much as I'm teaching. I mean, there's just no way for that not to happen. The way that writing teaching happens is you're given a manuscript that someone else has worked on, and your job, my job as a writing teacher, my sort of base level, have I succeeded as a writing teacher or not, is I want the student to be more excited and more engaged when they're done with me than they were coming into the class or coming into the office. And that isn't necessarily how the sort of ethos that has permeated writing instruction through the years, where there's a lot of kind of beating up on people. Having said that, I don't believe that that happens just by telling people their work is wonderful. I believe that it happens by educating people about their craft choices. So I'm a very craft-driven teacher, meaning I will talk a lot about strategies and, point of view, tense, a million things like that. And not so much like, I didn't like this character, I really loved that character, but to try to empower students. And when you're doing that as a teacher, one of the sort of gifts of it, aside from having, hopefully having a positive impact on an emerging writer, one of the gifts is that sometimes you'll realize something about your own work, that you're so close to your own work, it can be hard to see that there's some problem with narrative distance, or there's something you keep doing. But by kind of living through someone else's process, you can often, I will go like, oh, yeah, of course, for me. So it's, it is kind of spiritually enriching because you're helping somebody else be creative. And, in my experience with writers, and maybe that isn't true of this group, and I always feel when I say this that like maybe somebody's going to say, but in my experience of writers are almost invariably people who felt significantly silenced at some point in their lives, whether for political reasons, familial reasons, cultural, religious, a million things. And so when you're helping someone write, you're helping them break through the inhibitions of that early silencing. And that's, I get choked up doing it. I try not to cry when I teach, but yeah, it's very meaningful to me.
Yeah, thank you. And they're still mowing. But this is from the sublime to the ridiculous. I'm sorry about the mowing, but I think we're all wondering, and I love that you read that passage about the artists and the creative process, and clearly there's, and you admitted to us already that there's a lot there that you recognize in yourself. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little. How much is that analogy for your process? How much of it is literal? It's so poetic and beautiful. And I just have this, I will have an enduring image of those newspapers being ironed. So tell us about how that experience relates to your writing and creative process.
So I am not a plot writer. I'm not, or I ultimately, I mean, my work has plots. It's not like, super avant-garde or anything, but I am never driven to write a story by the phrase, I'd love to write a story in which such and such and such happens. My brain just doesn't work that way. And, I don't know the extent to which that relates to, I have very serious ADD, and I often wonder if the kind of way I go about things relates to that. But I describe how I begin a story as like you're walking down the pavement and you trip over a crack. And for me, it's that tripping over something where I'll just see, oh, people relate that way. That's really interesting. Or, oh, there's something fascinating about, a particular metaphoric image or something like that. Or with one of the stories in my book, my daughter as a child had very serious word retrieval issues. And I really thought that was an interesting thing to write about because of the kind of invasive relationship I needed to have with her in order to know what words to give her as she was fishing for them. I had to always sort of be in her brain. And I was fascinated by that. There was no story that went with it. And the way the story, which is a long one in my book, it's like 40 pages long or something, evolved was I thought, well, what's another relationship that has that potential for kind of invasive intimacy? And the story I ended up with is about two 65-year-old twins, male and female, man and woman in Italy, off to celebrate their birthday. And he has basically my daughter's word retrieval issue. But so there's a lot of just kind of associative thinking and just, I don't know, it's a funny process. It's never linear is what I would say. So my description of Gus, my character, just sort of trying this and trying that and reaching out and seeing what happens. That's very much what I do.
Thanks. And, since we first spoke many months ago, I've been very intrigued by this Mrs. Dalloway book. So can you say a little something about Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway and how you relate to that?
Yeah, so the series, it's part of a series which is called Bookmarked, which is one author writes about one book, and it's kind of, you're doing a sort of analysis of the book, but you're also discussing your own relationship to it. And, Mrs. Dalloway is a book that I didn't read until I was 40 something, 41 or 42. And so I didn't have that sort of high school experience with it. But as soon as I read it, it's funny, I can't say I like loved it, but it felt meaningful to me in a way that very few books do. Part of it is I have a history of agoraphobia for 18 years. I was a pretty full-on agoraphobe. And there's so much in the book about sort of being out in the world with different states of mind. I think some of that resonated with me. But it's also, I think ultimately, it's like Woolf's intelligence behind the book that I really love to hear. And so we'll see. I mean, I'm still mid-book, so I don't have a succinct answer on why it means so much to me, but I'm enjoying exploring it.
I'm interested in that whole genre too. There's the Rebecca Mead writing about Middlemarch. And, I think a lot of writers looking back at the things that kind of made them the kind of writers that they are and our relationship to books. So I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask the other three participants, what's on your nightstand right now? What are you reading? What are you looking forward to reading?
So on my nightstand right now, to be honest, are just like all of Virginia Woolf's diaries and letters and Mrs. Dalloway and everything having to do with that book. I also have been taking with my mother as a kind of mother-daughter thing, the class at the Rosenbach on the Anthony Pohl series. And it's very interesting. They're very, they're very sort of upper crusty, very white, very British books. And it's interesting to read them now and to find them not as appealing as I found them when I was 25. I mean, there's a lot of snobbery in them, but that's what's on my night table.
Thank you. Katherine, what's on your night table?
A stack of research books that I should be reading that I'm not reading because they're very dense. And by the time I get into bed, I'm tired and I want to read something that's not quite as so dense. So I just started reading We Dream of Space by Erin and Trotta Kelly, which is a middle grade novel about 3 kids when the Challenger explodes. So leading up to the Challenger and then the wake of the Challenger. And it was a Newbery honor book. I mean, it's exquisitely done. All of Erin's work is exquisitely done, but it's really, really good. And I'm hoping to finish that tonight. Ivy, you're muted again.
Sorry, they're mowing. Louise, what's on your night table?
I can't wait to answer this question because I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. First of all, right at the moment, I'm reading Anxious People and I'm reading Trust Exercise. I recommend them both to you, and I can't remember the authors of either one. So I apologize to these authors who have written their hearts out, but 2 absolutely terrific books to read. Trust Exercise, stunning. It's a book full of surprises. And the other one, Anxious People, which is it's kind of a meta novel, really. So I think that for writers, it's especially interesting book to read. But I also want to mention that I've been watching Shtisel, and I watched The Queen's Gambit, and I'm now enjoying my TV more than I ever did in my life. Never thought that the TV would be my TV. Yeah, it's happening that way. So look at me both ways now.
Interesting. Thank you. Rachel, what's on your night table?
Came this close to lying because I read a lot of things that I feel like are kind of not literature and also like probably not lauded. But I'm reading a book right now called How Carrots Won the Trojan War. It's a series of essays about like vegetables. But I really love it. I mean, it gets a little repetitive, you know, when you're like on your 9th page about potatoes and like how many times can we bring Thomas Jefferson's garden into this. So it's like not a great book, but this kind of like weird nonfiction fact finding is often what gives me like an idea for something. So that's what I like to read. In a more like probably professional answer, what's sitting on my desk next to me as like a book I'm studying is The Arrival by Sean Tan. Like I said, I'm trying to like get myself together to write a graphic novel or to illustrate a graphic novel, but I've never done that before. Well, not at least in a professional capacity. I did a couple in art school, but it's a wordless, absolutely beautiful graphic novel that I highly recommend if you're looking for one.
And so, thank you. Gail brings up another question. I think this is a good one to do with all of you as well. What's the balance of your writing life? When do you write? How does it fit into the rest of the things that you do? And Rachel, I'm going to start with you since you're conveniently here and unmuted.
Yeah. I'm the first person to like give the unglamorous answer on this one too. I have a day job. I prefer it that way. I work as a communications specialist for a nonprofit that connects psychological researchers with schools. So it's like very much in the education realm, which I feel like is the through line of my varied bodies of work. But I'm not a prolific writer or artist. I try to do a little every day, but I don't like the pressure of feeling like I have to take on a project to pay my mortgage. Like it's not the kind of person I am. And I feel like for me, I really admire people who do it, but for me, that hustle ruins my work. So yeah, I like the work that I do. I feel like I'm making a difference in a small way. And then I get to well, at this point, I just move from one laptop to the other laptop, but I used to come home and paint in this is my studio, but now I just sit in here all day.
Interesting, thank you. Katherine.
I would say that I'm very, very bad at balance. I also have a day job. So I write before work, I write over my lunch breaks, I write after work, I write on weekends. I try to have one weekend day where I don't do any work. I don't freelance. I don't read for like research books for work. I don't write. So I do try to take a day off a week, but I work a lot, but I'm a pretty fast writer and I'm a pretty prolific writer. So I can really churn things out. So I tend to work in big batches. So I write a whole bunch for a couple of months and then I don't write for like 6 months and I just revise or chew or work on or go back and forth with my agent about any of those things. So I haven't actually written like since August, I would say, and I just started writing again now. So I tend to be a pretty cyclical writer that way.
Muted again.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, Louise.
Well, most of you won't know that I had a very large family and still live with my youngest daughter and my 2 youngest grandchildren. So I wrote early in the morning and late at night, and I would find myself suddenly immersed in writing, and it would become later and later at night. And now I read, and I'm warning you all that I just read this in the Times, that if you don't get enough hours of sleep, you are going to give yourself dementia. And yes, I'm 83 and I'm becoming demented. So keep that as a warning in mind when you're writing and it's very, very late and you're really, really loving it. Oh yeah, but what's the future going to hold for me? Okay, there you are, folks.
Okay. Thank you, Louise, and thank you for the advice. I think we all, a lot of us read that article and are very, very concerned for ourselves and our future. So.
No, it's not my future. It's my present already, Ivy. Here I am.
Okay, I think you're doing okay, Louise.
Sometimes.
I think you're all right. Any other questions from this gang? I know that.
I didn't get to hear from Robin.
Oh, I'm sorry, Robin.
Dang, I thought I was gonna get away with that. Thanks.
No, sorry, you're not getting off the hook.
It's varied tremendously over the years. I, for many reasons, didn't start writing seriously till I was 39, which is 20 years ago. And at that point, for about 10 years, it was just constant. I mean, I would be having dinner with my husband and he would say, "Are you writing?" And I was like, "Eh, might be." And then there's just been a kind of difference. In that period, I wrote 3 books like my life depended on it, my emotional life. And now I don't write as much, and I keep sort of hoping I'll get back there. But I try to write several days a week, but I've also gone years without. And I found in the beginning of these are recent troubled times politically for me, from my perspective. I found writing fiction impossible. It was impossible to create a world that to me felt as important or as compelling as what was just going on around me. And I still have some of that. And but yeah, it's pretty sporadic. I mean, some of that is also ADD driven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I am told that our official time is up, but that folks can hang out for another, Gail or Ellen will correct me, I think for another 15 minutes or so if anyone wants to stick around and chat. But I am so inspired by the 4 of you and can't wait to start reading all of your stuff and thinking about and digesting what you've shared with us this evening. So thank you so much, all of you.
Thank all of you.
So I'm not moderating, but everyone is allowed to unmute and chat as they'd like. I am muting because of the mowing.
The mowing's not too bad, Ivy, I promise. It's, we can,
I can't hear the mowing at all.
yeah,
It's not what you think it is.
yeah.
No, but thank you so much, Ivy. Thank you for being here with us and taking care of us.
Really a privilege to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
shepherding
you.
us through this.
Yeah.
I was
Thank you.
wondering how it would ever work.
Ivy, thank you for putting this together. I think my daughter knows you, Joni Schwartz. Yeah, oh, you're muted.
Oh, yes, I know.
Yeah.
I know Joni forever. And just for the record, let me say, I did not put this together. Gail put this together.
That's okay. I know.
I,
That's all right.
I'm helping, but
Well, I
so nice
didn't,
to
I
meet
know I'm
you.
a writer too, but, and I've had books published. So I'm so happy to meet everyone because I really don't have a writing group in Philadelphia now. And the Authors Guild did put something together, but we don't really talk about writing. We just talk about the other stuff. And so I'm really thrilled, and I hope I get in touch with some of you. And to
Nice.
be able to talk to someone about writing also is very inspiring for me. And today was very inspiring. So thank you for being here. And
Thank you.
You know, it's lucky for us that someone got that from this program. I tell her, you know, say thank you so much. Who is this person? What? Tell us her name.
and I'm talking Adele Greenspun. I'm
Oh.
all the way on the left in the little squares.
I don't know if the others could see them. I don't think we could see you, Adele, but that's very, very lovely of you to say that.
Oh, yeah, I really mean it too. I didn't want to write it in the chat, but I'm happy I have the opportunity to tell you. It was extremely, and I just hope I can meet with some of the writers again if you have time. And I am working on something now that's pretty powerful. So thank you.
I like when writers get together because so pre-pandemic, I used to run a group of kidlit writers in Philadelphia who would get together. We were supposed to talk about like writing, and mostly we would just talk about the business, and then we would leave really depressed. We've been talking about what it's going to look like going forward as vaccines have been rolling out, and my co-leader for that group was like, what if this time we actually talked about writing? And I was like, bold new world, could actually happen.
I think that's interesting. I think it's one of the things that happens is like when I think about earlier in my career, kind of pre-books, it was much more about writing. And I think that, you know, after you've had a book or even, I mean, even just one book, I think does this, breaks it somehow, that it's very hard to get your mind out of, you know, questions about sales and questions about reviews and questions about, you know, who's buying what now and who's doing what. And I just think that brings up a really interesting point of like what it is actually like to be a writer, which is there's like a lot of garbage in it, you know, along with the joys of creating art and supporting other artists and all of that. There's also like this part of your brain that I didn't even know I had until I was involved with Random House. And then it's like, what is going on here? And it's so hard to get that, to kind of claw out of that and back to just the purity of doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I would say that that is like probably my biggest day-to-day challenge when working is to not worry about my past sales numbers, my next book coming out and promotion and whether my editor is actually going to like it, and just like actually write the book. That's a big challenge.
I felt like when I was writing my story collection, I didn't know I was writing a story collection, and I wrote the stories just assuming that the only person who would ever read them was my mother. And I think it was, and she's a really good reader. She is a critical reader, but I think it was like a gift then that I didn't understand what a gift it was not to think you're trying to be out in the world.
Mhm. Yep.
Also, I found that the publishing world changes. The first book I did was called Daddies, and it had black and white photographs in them. And I mean, it did very, very well. And then the publishing world said, no, we don't want black and white photographs. The children don't like black and white photographs. And I knew they were wrong because I would go into the schools with the books, and they didn't, they didn't take, they wanted pictures. So the next books, my daughter, who was an illustrator, she colored the black and white photographs for me. And so that's changed too. And now cartoons are really popular, it seems to me, and other things, but photographs they don't want anymore. So it just keeps changing.
Mhm.
Good point.
Yeah, I try not to get hung up on anything that anyone ever says, like, it's not hot right now, because like I'm sorry, but like that's one person's opinion. Like, I don't know.
And it also, it doesn't matter, because by the time you sell the book,
yeah,
it comes out 3 years later and everything's changed again. So there's no point in trying to write to a trend.
And also, I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I had that experience when I'd written my story collection, and most of the agents I spoke to then only wanted to work with me on my novel. And they all said, well, let's just forget you ever wrote a story collection. And my actual agent was like the only person in New York who said, no, I think we can sell it, and did. But like, if I had gone with anybody else, there would have been this story collection sitting there that became like a book that people enjoyed. And it was just like the common wisdom was story collections don't sell. And I think it's so smart to just like break away from the common wisdom, which is almost always wrong, or which has exceptions, or, you sort of have to believe that you're the exception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a certain amount of ego involved in surviving and publishing.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So Rachel, I wanted to ask you, this is like a non-literary question. So I was visiting my son in Brooklyn the other day, and is there a street named after her?
Only recently, and like was just renamed a year and a half ago. I went there to like go see the street, and there was a big construction van parked in front of the street sign, but it is there.
It only caught my eye because I had met you in a previous Zoom meeting, and I was like, wait a minute, I know, she really built the Brooklyn Bridge. It was cool to see.
Yeah, they were actually, she's become, I mean, I honestly got unbelievably lucky to get in on this ground floor of like people caring about Emily Roebling, because like no one cared about Emily Roebling when I was researching this book. I kept writing to the Cold Spring Historical Society, and they were like, who are you? What is your problem? But now I do feel like all of a sudden she keeps getting trotted out as like an unsung literary heroine. Actually, there was another picture book about her that came out only a couple of months after mine, from a Canadian press of all places.
So you're a trendsetter, is that what you're trying to tell us?
I mean, I'm not. It definitely has nothing to do with me, but it is very interesting. I think the population or popularity swell comes from the New York Times wrote a like belated obituary of her that came out.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think in 2008, or yeah, like it was the end of 2018. And I remember because my book was like, I had submitted it, it was being printed, it was going to come out in a few months, and I had all these people emailing me like, did you see the New York Times? It's like, I had nothing to do with this, but I appreciate that it's happening.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. But can you imagine if I had written this book and tried to sell it and all of this happened and I didn't? And I would have been like the sour guy at the bar, like, I wrote a book about that, you know?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I'm having something which is like crushingly worse, which is this has become like the year of Mrs. Dalloway. So I'm working on this book and there's just like endless other people writing about Mrs. Dalloway. And it's just a complete coincidence. Like I had no idea. And now I'm having like, you know, literal nightmares that I'm at dinner parties with them all and they're telling me how bad my book is compared. I mean, it's, so it doesn't always break the way you want it to.
True. I did have the, like, I mean, they say don't read the reviews, but I didn't listen. And somebody like did a comparison of my book and that other Emily Roebling book. And I was just like, I feel like you're missing the point of mine. It's fine. But yeah, you know, you're not going to please everybody.
Yeah. And also, you know, the book isn't for adults, it's for kids. So unless a child was writing that review.
No.
Yeah.
I actually would have really loved to be burned by a 9-year-old who hated my book. I think that would have been delightful.
Well, teenagers, when I do school visits, teenagers will burn you right to your face.
Oh, I bet.
I've also had teenagers bring me a list of the typos that made it through copy edits and be like, would you like to fix these? And I'm like, I wish I could. I wish I didn't know about them. Now I do.
Yeah.
You're a brave person. I am afraid of no group of people more than teenagers.
Oh, they're awesome. I do a lot of middle school visits with Girl with a Red Balloon because it's kind of a younger YA. And like 8th grade is like my favorite grade to do because they don't realize that it's not cool to be nerdy yet. So they're still like enthusiastic about all of their esoteric interests, which is like just really fun to like talk to people who can like have a conversation with an adult that is linear. And but also they're like, oh my God, can I tell you every fact I know about Peter Parker? And I'm like, yeah, go for it. Tell me all the facts about Peter Parker. So yeah, I love talking to teenagers.
Nice.
Fun.
That's awesome. I mean, I guess you would have to, but it's great that you do.
Yeah. Ivy, you're muted.
I am.
Now you are.
I can hear you now.
Great. I just wanted to thank everyone so much for this. Really, really generous and inspiring, and gives us so much to think about. And thank you all for doing the work that you're doing, and everyone else for joining us. And good luck in all your creative endeavors. And keep us posted.
Thank you so much, Ivy. Really appreciate your moderating.
Thank
Yes.
you, Ivy.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Goodbye. Thank you.